The ground was still frozen when the first grave was opened. A gray sky hung over western Germany on the morning of March 10, 1945. The war was entering its final and most desperate weeks. Villages were shattered, roads were crowded with refugees, smoke drifted across fields that only months earlier had been peaceful farmland. Near the town of Remagen, not far from the recently captured Ludendorff Bridge, American soldiers moved through a landscape that seemed exhausted by years of destruction. In a quiet clearing beyond the front lines, several men with shovels worked in silence. The hole they were digging was not large. It did not need to be. They knew exactly why they were there. Beside them rested a simple wooden marker with a name carefully written on it. A few miles away, another grave was being prepared. This one lay near a damaged churchyard where German civilians had already buried several local soldiers killed during the fighting. The grave was narrow, lonely, and almost forgotten amid the chaos. No ceremony had been planned. No crowd was expected. War had become too desperate for that. And farther away still, near a temporary prisoner compound surrounded by barbed wire, a third grave waited. Nobody knew the name of the man who would lie there. Not the American guards, not the German prisoners, not even the soldiers who had found the body. 3 graves, 3 dead men, 3 stories moving toward the same moment. And before that day was over, hundreds of German prisoners would witness something they never forgot, something that haunted them long after the guns had fallen silent. The first grave belonged to Private First Class Robert Miller, a 22-year-old infantryman from Ohio. He had crossed the Atlantic with thousands of others. Like many young soldiers, he had carried photographs from home inside his jacket pocket. He had spoken often about returning after the war. He never did. 2 days earlier, during fighting near the Rhine, a burst of machine gun fire had cut him down while his unit advanced through a wooded ridge. The battle moved on. The front continued eastward. But now his comrades had returned. War moved fast. Memory moved slower. That morning, several men from his company stood nearby as the grave was completed. Their uniforms were muddy. Their faces were tired. Most had seen too much death to speak about it anymore. Yet nobody rushed. Nobody treated the task as a burden. One soldier carefully brushed dirt from the wooden marker before placing it beside the grave. Another straightened the folded blanket covering the body. A chaplain quietly reviewed his notes. The details were small, but every detail mattered. Meanwhile, at the second grave, a different story unfolded. The dead man was Obergefreiter Karl Weiss, a German soldier killed during a retreat several days earlier. His family did not know where he was. His unit no longer existed as an organized formation. The officers who once commanded him had vanished into the collapsing front. A local farmer and 2 elderly civilians had arranged the burial. There were no military honors available, no band, no firing party, no official ceremony, only necessity. The war had become too chaotic for anything else. Yet even here, the grave represented something larger. A life, a son, a husband, a man who would never return home. The third grave remained the most mysterious. Early that morning, American engineers repairing a damaged road had discovered a body near a shell crater. The uniform was heavily damaged. Identification papers were missing. Even the nationality was difficult to determine at first glance. Weeks of combat had erased many clues. The dead man became known simply as unknown. A temporary marker was prepared. A grave was selected. And arrangements were made. Nobody expected that this nameless soldier would eventually become the center of the day's most powerful moment. By midday, a group of German prisoners had been assigned work details near the American cemetery area. Most were young. Some were veterans. Others had surrendered only days earlier. Many expected hostility. After years of propaganda, they viewed their captors through assumptions formed by war. Some believed Americans were soft. Others believed they were ruthless. Most simply did not know what to expect. What they witnessed that afternoon challenged everything. The burial of Private Miller began shortly after 1 o'clock. The prisoners were close enough to observe, not close enough to participate, just close enough to see. The American soldiers gathered around the grave. The chaplain stepped forward. Heads bowed. The wind moved gently through the trees. For several minutes, nothing dramatic happened. No speeches filled with anger, no celebration of victory, no hatred directed toward the enemy, only grief, only respect. The German prisoners watched carefully. Some expected military formality. What surprised them was the emotion. These hardened combat soldiers were not hiding their loss. Several stared silently at the grave. One wiped his eyes. Another looked down at the ground. The dead soldier was not being treated as a statistic. He was being treated as a person. That detail stayed with many observers. Because by 1945, death had become common. So common that many soldiers on all sides had learned to protect themselves emotionally. Yet here were men taking time during an active campaign to honor one fallen comrade. The ceremony ended with a rifle salute. The sound echoed across the countryside. Then came silence. The prisoners expected everyone to leave immediately. Instead, several soldiers remained. One adjusted the marker again. Another carefully checked the grave. The smallest details continued to matter. The prisoners noticed. And they remembered. Later that afternoon, attention shifted unexpectedly toward the third grave, the unknown soldier. Word spread among American units that arrangements had been completed. A small burial party assembled. Again, German prisoners observed from nearby work areas. At first, the ceremony seemed similar. The chaplain stood before the grave. Several soldiers formed a respectful line. The body rested beneath a simple covering. But then, something unusual happened. The chaplain spoke about the dead man despite not knowing his name. He spoke about sacrifice, about family, about the possibility that somewhere someone was waiting for news that might never arrive. The words carried weight because they acknowledged uncertainty. Nobody knew whether the soldier had been American or German. Nobody knew his rank. Nobody knew his story. Yet he would still be buried with dignity. The prisoners exchanged glances. This was not what many expected. One former German sergeant later recalled being deeply unsettled by the scene. Not because it was frightening, because it was difficult to understand. Years of war had taught soldiers to divide humanity into categories. Friend, enemy, ally, opponent, yet this ceremony seemed to ignore those lines. The dead man received respect before anyone even knew which uniform he had served. That realization lingered. As afternoon turned toward evening, the three graves seemed unrelated. One American, one German, one unknown. But events were quietly bringing them together. Near sunset, information finally arrived regarding the unidentified body. Investigators examining damaged equipment discovered a fragment of identification hidden inside a torn pocket. The result surprised everyone. The unknown soldier was German, not American. German news spread through nearby units. Some soldiers barely reacted. The war contained too much death for major discussion. But among the prisoners who had witnessed the ceremony, the discovery landed differently. because they understood what it meant. The honors had already been given. The prayers had already been spoken. The respect had already been shown. And none of it had depended on nationality. The dead man had received dignity before his identity was known. That fact became impossible to ignore. For many prisoners, it challenged assumptions built over years, yet the strongest moment was still ahead. As darkness approached, American personnel responsible for cemetery operations made a simple decision. The newly identified German soldier would remain where he had been buried. The marker would be updated, the records corrected, but the respect shown earlier would stand. Nothing would be withdrawn, nothing would be reconsidered. The ceremony had been offered freely. Several prisoners later described feeling an unexpected discomfort, not anger, not resentment, something more complicated. The realization that compassion could survive even in war. The realization that enemies could still recognize humanity in one another. And for men who had spent years inside one of history's most destructive conflicts, that realization carried enormous weight. Days passed. The front continued moving east. More battles followed. More soldiers died. More graves appeared across Europe. Yet memories from that March afternoon remained. After Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, millions of soldiers began returning home or entering captivity. Among them were countless former prisoners who carried memories from the final months of fighting. Years later, some spoke about major battles. Others remembered famous generals. Many recalled moments of fear. But a surprising number remembered cemeteries. Burials, funerals, simple acts of respect. Historians studying prisoner accounts after the war noticed recurring themes. Again and again, former German soldiers described being struck by how American units honored their dead. Not because such ceremonies were unique. Military funerals existed everywhere. What stood out was the consistency, the effort, the determination to preserve individual identity amid enormous loss. American graves registration units worked tirelessly throughout the war. Their mission extended beyond burial. They recorded names, collected personal effects, marked locations, maintained records, contacted families. Even during major operations, enormous effort went into ensuring fallen soldiers would not simply disappear. This work required thousands of personnel and countless hours. German prisoners occasionally witnessed portions of that process. Many had never considered how extensive it was. The impact often came from small observations. A soldier carefully cleaning a marker. A chaplain speaking a name aloud. Friends standing silently beside a grave. Simple actions, yet powerful ones. One former prisoner later wrote that the ceremonies forced him to think differently about death. On the battlefield, death often felt anonymous. Numbers replaced faces, statistics replaced lives. But funerals reversed that process. They restored individuality. They reminded observers that every casualty represented a unique human story. That lesson stayed with him. And he was not alone. The 3 graves from that March day became symbolic in ways nobody could have predicted. Private Miller represented the visible cost of war. A young man whose future ended on a battlefield far from home. Karl Weiss represented the tragedy shared by millions of families across Europe. A soldier caught inside events larger than himself. The unknown German represented something even broader, the reality that human dignity could survive despite hatred, destruction, and loss. Together, the graves told a story larger than any single nation. A story about memory, about respect, about the choices people make when surrounded by violence. Years after the war, many battlefields disappeared beneath roads, farms, and new buildings. Forests regrew, cities rebuilt, scars faded, yet military cemeteries remained, row after row of markers, silent reminders of extraordinary sacrifice. Visitors often focused on famous battles, but veterans frequently remembered smaller moments, moments invisible to history books, moments like a funeral witnessed from a distance, moments when enemies lowered their guard long enough to recognize common humanity. For some former German prisoners, those memories became unexpectedly haunting, not because they involved horror, because they involved compassion. Compassion could be difficult to process, especially after years of conflict, especially after seeing the worst humanity could produce. The image remained fixed in memory. American soldiers standing beside a grave, a chaplain speaking quietly, a marker carefully positioned, a final salute echoing across the countryside. No triumph, no celebration, only respect. The kind of respect that acknowledged loss without needing words. And perhaps that is why the memory endured. Fear fades, shock fades, even many battlefield memories fade. But moments that challenge deeply held beliefs can last forever. On March 10, 1945, three graves stood beneath a cold German sky. One held an American soldier, one held a German soldier, one held a man whose identity was unknown until after his burial. At first they seemed unrelated. By day's end, they had become connected by something stronger than nationality, stronger than ideology, stronger than war itself. The prisoners who witnessed those burials did not see a military victory. They saw something far more unexpected. They saw men refusing to let death erase dignity. And decades later, long after the guns fell silent and the battlefields disappeared, that was the memory many could never escape. Not the explosions, not the surrender, not the prison camps, the graves, the quiet ceremonies, the respect shown to the fallen. Because in a war defined by destruction, those moments revealed something many thought had been lost. Humanity, and that, more than anything else, haunted them.